name's Stephen Hartley. I'm a member of the London and South East region of Young Rail Professionals, and I also work for Rail Delivery Group. And tonight's event is just one of a number of events organised by the London and South East region of YRP. So if you've not done so already, please do go and have a look at our website. All of our events are listed there. We have quite a big programme of events. Hopefully we'll be back to having some in-person events sooner rather than later. So it will be great to meet you all in person rather than just doing these online virtual events. And of course, also, if you've not done so already, please do go on the website and sign up for a YRP membership. It's absolutely free. Just go on there and sign up with your email address, and we can keep you posted on our future events. While I'm here, I'd just like to give a shout out and a thank you to all of our corporate sponsors for their financial assistance. It's down to the corporate sponsors that we can run our full programme of events. Their names are listed on the YRP website as well. So again, a big thanks to all our corporate sponsors for their assistance. And just before going any further, one item of housekeeping. I don't need to tell you where the toilets or the fire exits are this evening, but I do just need to let you know that this event is being recorded and the video is going to be published onto YouTube afterwards. So I hope that's okay with everybody. So down to the business of the evening. I hope that tonight's event might be the first of a series to explore some of the activities of Rail Delivery Group, RDG. For those of you that don't know, RDG is owned by the train operators of Great Britain and acts on behalf of the industry at a national level. And while we're got a relatively small organisation with, I think, around about 300 staff, the tasks undertaken are quite varied and diverse across the industry. Of course, I say this, all of this might be about to change due to the recently published Williams-Shapps review that we've read, at least part of, I'm sure. But given the focus this evening is pretty much all about customer satisfaction, I'm very confident this important work will continue, be that within RDG itself or another corporate entity in the near future. So the Wavelength programme, which we're going to hear about, is all about collecting data that measures customers' opinions of the railway. And perhaps more importantly, it's also about how that data can be used to implement positive changes for passengers. I'd like to introduce you all this evening to Billy Denyer, who is RDG's Director of Insights. And Billy and his team have been working for a couple of years now, I think, on the Wavelength programme. And this is something which has been growing in significance for both the train operators and the industry. I'd like to thank Billy for joining us today for what I'm sure will be really quite an eye-opening and informative presentation. Just to let you know, we have allowed time at the end of the presentation for some questions, so do keep a note of anything you'd like to ask. For that, please just drop any questions if you can into the chat function of the Teams. Hopefully that's okay. And I'll attempt to do my best to do some moderation at the end, and we'll get all those questions covered off. So in the meantime, I'd like to hand the stage over to Billy, who's going to tell us all about the Wavelength programme and its relevance for us, both as rail staff and as passengers. So thank you very much indeed, Billy.
Thank you, Stephen. Evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining. A few familiar names on the participants list, so good to see you all again, and a lot of names that I've never come across. So no, it's great to spread the word about Wavelength and about the focus on customer experience more generally. As Stephen said, yeah, I'm RDG's Director of Insights. Been at RDG quite some time, 15 years now. Previously ATOC in a variety of insights related roles. I started off in demand forecasting, moved into commercial analysis and market research, and actually the Wavelength programme, as Stephen said, is a sort of combination of all that stuff really, but with a real focus on the customer, which actually I think we probably as an industry haven't done enough of throughout our, I guess recent history, certainly having that joined up approach to focusing on the customer across the industry. And I'll talk about how the Wavelength programme is looking to address that. I'm going to be talking for probably half an hour or so. There are lots of slides, so I might whiz through a few of them. Happy to circulate the slides after. But as Stephen said, take a note of any questions you might have, add them on the chat if you want to. And if we don't get to any of them, this evening, then very happy to answer them offline or afterwards anyway. So I shall share my slides. Can you see that?
Yep, thank you.
So that's a good start. So yeah, I'm really going to be talking about initially actually just a high level overview of customer satisfaction, customer experience, some of the recent trends. I will talk about sort of COVID related aspects of that later on in the presentation, and then I'll be moving on to the Wavelength program specifically around how we're looking to embed that within the industry to improve the granularity of information we have around the customer experience, but also embed that sort of customer focused ethos across the industry. I'll also talk about the structure of some of the data we're getting, how we're looking to maybe join that up with other data sources in due course, and some recent insights we've got from the program. And then finally, I'll talk a bit about more recent data through COVID, through the various restrictions and relaxations, and maybe some opportunities that actually are there, I think, for us all to seize in the future, because we know that customers will be traveling in a different way than they did previously, and that's a challenge, but also a great opportunity. So you may be familiar with this chart. This is taken from the National Rail Passenger Survey, measures customer experience twice a year, and throughout the last 2 decades, or from the late 90s, we saw a gradual improvement in overall customer satisfaction, peaking at 85% in autumn 2012. Actually, since then, it's tailed away a little. It's not drastically terrible, but clearly there's more we can do. We're still above 80%, still more than 4 in 5 customers are satisfied, but there's clearly a lot we need to do, especially in the post-COVID world, where actually it's really important that we attract people back to the railways, attract new people to the railways, because we know people have more choice in the way they work and travel now than they ever have before. Just in terms of that recent drop, also through some of the Transport Focus insight, we see that there are some real core drivers of overall satisfaction and overall dissatisfaction, real sort of functional hygiene factors that are essential to deliver well in order to satisfy our customers. So they're the same drivers really throughout that 20-year period around punctuality and reliability. Clearly, if the train doesn't arrive on time, then you're going to have a dissatisfied customer from the outset. And whilst that's the biggest driver of satisfaction, it's actually not one of the highest scores in terms of overall satisfaction. 74% is okay, but it's not one of the higher scores than NRPS. Then we look at overall dissatisfaction and what drives overall dissatisfaction. The biggest driver, so almost half of all dissatisfaction, is driven by how train companies dealt with delays. And again, actually, that's one of the metrics that has one of the highest levels of dissatisfaction. So I think there's obviously work we need to do there to focus on and ensure that those hygiene factors, those real functional characteristics of travelling by rail, are delivered as well as possible. And when things do go wrong, the industry responds in the right way. And just from personal experience, a couple of times I've travelled into London in recent weeks back into the office, actually they have been challenging journeys, and we need to try and make sure that those first journeys back for people are enjoyable, do what they say they will do, and we get people from A to B on time and in a really relaxed and enjoyable way. Just another way of visualizing those drivers of satisfaction and demand, you'll see that the lower satisfaction, punctuality and reliability there, for example, is the higher impact satisfaction driver. Likewise, how delays are dealt with, higher levels of dissatisfaction and a higher impact on overall dissatisfaction. And you might have seen this slide. This also comes from Transport Focus. It highlights passengers' priorities for improvement. Again, around the core drivers, core factors of the experience, I guess, around reliability, punctuality, value for money. We know that's an amalgam of all sorts of components. Price is one of those, but other things come into that as well. And actually, ability to get a seat, bit less of an issue at the moment as we've got far fewer people travelling. But that's clearly become more of an issue, especially if social distancing is retained in some capacity. But actually, what we noticed at RDG is, they clearly are core drivers of satisfaction, the things I've just been talking about. But what we weren't doing as an industry was really connecting with customers in a more emotional way. We didn't really, as an industry, have promises or a charter that we could really communicate to our customers what could they expect from on a sort of emotional, more in terms of an emotional connection with the railway. So a few years ago, we developed 5 customer promises, which are embedded within the Wavelength program. I'll explain how that's the case later. These are always on, clear value, feeling loved, in control, and travel my way. And these are 5 promises that are customer board, so that features customer and commercial directors across the owner groups. And they signed up to those a couple of years ago. And within RDG, we've been deliberately referencing these promises when we plan new initiatives and launch new products. And it's really important to us that these are front and center in the way that the industry is developing and we're delivering for customers. What you may also have seen is that in the white paper, the previously mentioned William Schaap's review, there were 9 customer needs. In a way, they're similar to the customer promises I've just flashed up. They're a bit of a cross between the promises and actually some of those more functional drivers of satisfaction and demand, in fact. And what we've done at RDG is been quite closely or heavily embedded in those sort of strategic reform conversations. So the whole industry strategic plan, WISP, which some of you may have heard of, is an example of one of those sort of reform programs that's looking to develop a customer strategy for the longer term. And we've been very keen to ensure that the work we've done on Wavelength, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail, is embedded into this work and how the white paper is taken forward. So in terms of Wavelength itself, Wavelength is a program that is designed to improve customer experience, not just through the collection of data, but like I said, that real focus on the customer. It is funded by DFT and it's run by ourselves at RDG in partnership with DFT, but obviously on behalf of all our members. The way that RDG operates is that we undertake activity that our members support, and they essentially have funded it prior to COVID. The core deliverable in the Wavelength survey is a weekly feedback, or the Wavelength program is a weekly feedback survey. So that looks to measure around about 100 touch points, and by touch points I mean interactions between customers and the rail industry. They aren't necessarily human interactions. They can be interactions on a journey planner or on an app, or the way they consume information. But we mapped this out a few years ago and identified about 100 touch points that we're now measuring on a weekly basis in terms of the overall satisfaction with those, as well as those 5 customer promises. Really important to stress that we don't believe Wavelength should just be about the data. Clearly, the data is critical because understanding the customer experience helps us understand where the priorities for improvement are, and therefore the initiatives that we need to deliver as an industry to improve the experience. But actually, we want it to be really embedded across the industry in terms of the way we focus on the customer, not just around the data, but other bits of insight we might get. And actually, we feel Wavelength has the potential to be a really strong brand that we can communicate to the public. We're on your wavelength, we're tuning into you. It's a bit corny perhaps, but we haven't had that as an industry, and we do need, especially with the transition to GBR and so on in the future, we really do need that whole industry approach to this. So we've been working on a customer strategy, a joined up customer strategy in association with our customer board, but also speaking to the other sort of reform programs as well. I mentioned WISP just now. There are others. The Rail Revenue Recovery Group is a good one to cite. There's also work obviously in terms of what Great British Railways is going to look like in future. We want to make sure that all of that is joined up. We've got that cohesive approach to focusing on the customer. Just a few reasons why we need to focus on the customer. Clearly, the needs of customers have changed. Working patterns and lifestyle choices are now different to what they were pre-COVID. And even pre-COVID, there was more we could do in terms of the experience. We want to make sure there's a joined up approach. It's something that RDG has always struggled with a little, actually, in that we have 20 or so talks. We have 7 or 8 owning groups. They've had different approaches to delivering to the customer in the past, and we've been trying to pull that together into a consistent approach, and actually some of the reform initiatives within the white paper will further support that. And actually we want to become more accountable as an industry. Like I said, if we can communicate those promises or the 9 customer needs to the public, track them, demonstrate how we're performing, understand where the issues are against those promises or needs, and then demonstrate to our customers and even the non-customers where we're improving those, then that will hold us accountable, and actually that will engender more trust in the industry as well. I think what's really important also is that we are aligning our activities as an industry. So again, this will happen more, I'd imagine, through reform as things do become sort of more centralised. But actually, we want to ensure there isn't duplication, or there isn't there are disconnects or misalignment between initiatives, customer experience initiatives that might have absolutely the customer at the heart of them, but again may not be providing that network-wide improvement that we're looking to achieve. And we've been working, this is very much in development, but what we've been doing is working with our customer board at RDG to develop what we think that cohesive customer strategy is. So combining pre-existing strategies, you've probably come across some of the fares reform strategies previously. There's an information strategy, there's a smarter journey, smarter information, smarter journeys program that we run at RDG. There are all these individual strategies, and we want to make sure they're joined up into one overarching customer value proposition, but really importantly with those promises or potentially the needs going forward, and the wavelength touch points, which I'll come on to in a minute, as being the method or the mechanism for monitoring our performance against that overarching strategy. And these are very much in development as well, but these are the sort of 10 pillars that we think are really important to deliver for the customer, and that we would need to align our initiatives against. I think the bottom right one in particular is very important from my perspective. I would say this because I'm leading on the Wavelength program, but we need to ensure there's that mindset on the customer, there's that mindset to continue to measure how we're delivering for the customer, and how we can continue to improve that customer experience. Won't touch too much on that slide just because it could potentially be sensitive, but I think it's really important to understand also that wavelength does feature in operator contracts now. So in the IRMAs and the NRCs, there are clauses in there that require operators to engage with wavelength, which is great from our perspective, demonstrate how they're using the insight that comes from the wavelength program, and more generally using insight to improve the customer experience. And there is provision in those contracts to make more use of wavelength over time as the program and the data develops. And that's something we're really mindful of, that if operators are becoming incentivized more and more to deliver against the customer experience, then we need to ensure that the data that we're generating through wavelength is completely robust and rigorous. And we're still on a journey in that regard. Actually, through COVID, as demand levels were so low, it's quite challenging to get robust representative samples, and we're doing some work at the moment to further improve the data we're getting out of wavelength. But I'll give you some examples of the data we've got later on. So I think I've probably covered a lot of this. I mean, wavelength measures those customer interactions and the promise statements. We ask customers how they've experienced their journey. We collect the data through online panels. Again, we might need to change the way we collect the data in future. That was pretty much the only way we were able to through COVID, but you'll probably be aware National Rail Passenger Survey has more of a traditional approach, on train at station surveying, as well as some online stuff. We need to consider how the wavelength survey evolves to ensure that it's providing a really robust source of data for us to act upon. As I mentioned, there are 106 interactions within the full survey. These are split out across 8 journey steps, from exploring your options as to whether you would even travel by rail at all, to then planning your, deciding you travel by rail, planning your journey, buying your ticket either in advance at the station, turning up at the station, availing the facilities there, getting on the train, hopefully it's on time, and so on, enjoying your journey, arriving at the station, and so on. You get the picture. But we identified 106 touch points on that end-to-end customer journey, and as an industry, we hadn't collected. I know there have been pockets of great practice within individual operators where there's a real granular detail, but actually, as an industry, we didn't have that granularity or frequency of data across all those touch points. NRPS is excellent at what it does in terms of the 30 or so core metrics on train at station, but there was a lot sort of pre-journey that maybe we weren't capturing as an industry, and it's particularly important for RDG because we license the retailers, for example. We run national rail inquiries. There's some really key touch points we need to get right for the customer there, and this program is collecting data against all of those 106 touch points on a weekly basis. I won't go through the whole list, but you can see it there and there. But yeah, stay my word, there are 106 of them. In terms of how Wavelength has evolved, so I think a lot of credit has to go to the RDG CEO, so Jack Starr, who arrived at RDG in 2015, 2016, and she changed our focus, I think, as a RDG and in fact as an industry through our sort of governance groups, as being on the customer. Prior to that, and having been at RDG and previously ATOP for quite some time, there's a real commercial focus. But actually, once Jack arrived, we came to turn into a far more customer-focused organisation. Small things, but actually quite significant around talking about customers rather than passengers. Renaming our commercial board to customer board. We really do act as a customer-facing and customer-focused organisation now. We don't always have clearly that interaction with the end-to-end customer, and that's why we think it's really important. Other partners such as operators, Network Rail, retailers, and so on are supportive of this program as well. So what we did in 2016 was do a one-off snapshot of these 100 or so touch points, how we're performing in terms of satisfaction and the level of importance actually against each of those touch points. And the idea being we've got really low performing touch point, so low satisfaction, but really important, or expectations very high, and that should be a sort of priority area to address. If you fast forward on 5 years, we're now collecting that same data, so importance data, although it's actually static data at the moment on importance, but certainly satisfaction data on a weekly basis for all TOCs, and that's available to all TOCs and Network Rail on a weekly basis, and as I said, that features in DfT contracts. So we've come a long way. We've done a lot of work. There's still a long way to go actually to truly embed that data, and there's the onus on us to further improve the rigor of the data, so it can be used as intended at a really granular level to understand how the experience is changing week in, week out, station level in the case of sort of medium and larger stations as well. I mentioned previously, it's not just about the data, it's also about associated work streams that are looking to drive that focus on the customer. I won't talk about all these in detail, but there's work going on to understand how operators can be incentivized, or some sort of standardized approach to focusing on the customer. Sort of early days there, but again, it's all part of the reform picture. How we can engage with frontline staff to empower them, give them the insight that can help them deliver a great experience for customers as well. It's still quite early days in terms of these work streams, but we think it's really important. It's that holistic approach to delivering a better customer experience. The other administrative, maybe better to call it operational data piece, is really important as well, because if we're collecting weekly customer satisfaction data, if we can then combine that with, for example, weekly performance data or revenue data, then we can understand the linkages between some of those more commercial operational data sources and the experience. So we can make informed decisions then around what we do with timetables or service quality or so on and so forth, because we know what the impact will be on the experience. At RDG, so we collect the data on a weekly basis and push that out to TOCs through sort of two methods, or TOCs and Network Rail, as our members through two mechanisms really. We have a series of Tableau dashboards which show performance. You can feel, as you can imagine, you can slice and dice the data in all sorts of different ways. You look at it by TOC, by journey purpose, by time of day, day of week, and so on and so forth, sales channel. So it is really granular. What we need to build in a bit more, I think, is some more diagnostic information, understanding why. So at the moment we get average scores across all these touch points, but we don't necessarily know what's driving those average scores. Sometimes it's very obvious, but sometimes it's not. So actually, the next iteration of Wavelength data, I'd like to see more sort of qualitative or at least diagnostic information to understand what is driving some of those outcomes or outputs and how we can respond to them. But we've also got some headline KPIs within Wavelength around the traditional sort of KPIs around satisfaction, trust, and perception in the industry. And as I mentioned previously, we're measuring those customer promises, but there are some sort of proxy statements, which I'll come on to in a minute, actually, which sit beneath those customer promises, because we don't just want to go to our customers and ask them if they feel loved, because that might mean different things for different people. We've got 3 driver statements within each promise that help us understand the overall score for each promise. I've got a few slides here which show that those headline KPIs. I won't dwell on them too much. I'm conscious of time. We've been talking for sort of 20 minutes or so, and there's still quite a lot to go. But we have seen pretty good performance through the COVID period. So you can see on the left-hand side of this chart on the satisfaction and trust, they were both lower pre-COVID than they have been since COVID hit. That could be a combination of factors. Actually, those key drivers of satisfaction I talked about earlier, punctuality, how you deal with delays and so on, actually been less of an issue. Crowding, for example, less of an issue through COVID, because fewer people have been travelling and the service has generally been pretty punctual. Or it could just be the mix of people travelling, because we know that particularly through when key workers are travelling, or people that had to travel were generally more familiar with the service, generally more satisfied, very more comfortable travelling by rail at that time. And that's a similar picture for overall perception of the industry. So we ask customers what's their overall perception of the industry. Is it positive or negative or neutral? And again, there hasn't been a lot of movement, but that is more positive than it has been pre-COVID. Also, on those customer promises, we've seen stronger performance against those customer promises. So I think the summary here is we're doing some good stuff through COVID. I've been involved in some of those activities within RDG. Actually, I think as an industry, we've really come together to push out really useful information, generate some really helpful customer-facing propositions. The ones around season ticket refunds, for example, when COVID first hit. We've done a lot as an industry. It's really pulled us together, actually, through this terrible time, and we need to learn from that and continue to work in that way, because we're performing really well against these core metrics. And as I said, there are driver statements within each of those customer promises, and the ones around respect, openness, honesty, safety and security, that they're all performing well and better now than they did prior to COVID hitting. What we have seen is, so across those 106 touch points, there are a few that have dropped away, comparing the recent performance against what we had prior to COVID. And actually, I think that they are intuitive. Timetables reduced, so frequency reduced. Booking horizons got far lower, or far shorter, so people couldn't plan that far in advance. We know there was some negative feedback about those. Actually, they were really necessary at the time, but customers wanted a bit more surety about what trains were travelling when, and actually it did impact some of the wavelength touch points you can see there. But actually, some of the lower performing touch points pre-COVID have done quite well, done a lot better. Some of them, increasing by up to 1 out of 10, up to 10%, and that has meant that the range of scores has actually reduced. So whilst we had a range probably pre-COVID of sort of 6 to 8.5, that's now reduced to sort of more 7 to 8.5. So yeah, I think it's going to be important to keep an eye on that and actually see if some of those traditionally lower performing touch points reduce again once demand continues to increase, or hopefully continues to increase. We can see the scores by demographic, as you would expect, and different cuts of the data. Typically the lower age groups, I'm not blaming anyone on this call, but lower age groups that are scoring overall satisfaction lower. In many instances that may be sort of less familiarisation with the network or the tickets and so on. And also London South East and business customers actually mark it a little bit lower than the other sectors and the other journey purposes. But there's generally not a massive range in terms of the scores, and they're generally pretty strong, around 8 out of 10. What we have been really keen to try and achieve is identify sort of the so what kind of thing. So we've got all this data here, but what does it actually mean and what should we do about it? And we saw prior to Christmas, actually, a lot of the touch points, or not a lot, a couple of the touch points here had reduced their score. And we looked into that a little bit more. And again, it was the London South East regional issue. It was for some of the younger age groups and for males. And when we looked at it in a bit more detail, it was quite clear that the sort of cacophony of different policies prior to Christmas, so there were things like peak relaxations on some TOCs, there were shorter booking horizons for some, longer for others, refund policies varied by TOC, some long distance TOCs were reservation only and some weren't. And we recognised actually that was creating a lot of confusion, and we encouraged our members, our TOCs, and Network Rail through their sort of social media channels to really be far clearer around around these ticketing conditions, and I think that's an example of something we did as a result of the wavelength data, and actually those scores picked back up. It might have been actually because there was less confusion, fewer people were worried about that Christmas travel, but there were some really useful, tangible improvements made as a result of that. I won't go through all the detail here. You'll see it in the deck that you'll get afterwards. But we've got 106 touch points in wavelength. Actually, you're only measuring, I think, 94 of those at the moment because some of them just haven't been relevant or appropriate through COVID. We don't want to ask people if they've seen lots of promotional marketing activity, for example, during a global pandemic when people were being encouraged to stay at home. But what we are seeing is some low performing interactions still, particularly actually a couple around helping me with my luggage, which is quite challenging when social distancing is in place. But also Wi-Fi availability is one that is quite low scoring, but I think going to be really important through the recovery as people are more and more used to working in different places, both on board and at stations. And that's going to be an important thing to make sure we continue to deliver against. We also saw that station facilities have generally performed worse than the on-train scores. Station toilet cleanliness is one that in any survey you've ever seen, it never scores well, but actually it did deteriorate through this period. And again, that's the example of the kind of insights that we're sharing with our members, but also encouraging our members to dig into themselves and understand, is it particular stations or particular routes that have more of an issue in terms of cleanliness, for example. But conversely, there's some really high-performing interactions that have continued to remain high-performing interactions. And as I said, that the range of scores has actually condensed a bit. We're not seeing so many sort of 6 out of 10s. We're seeing, at the lowest end now more 7 out of 10s, and still up to sort of 8.5, which is good. But there's still scope for improvement, and that sort of links back to the customer strategy stuff I was talking about earlier. What we've also tried to do is embed this way of this evidence-based approach across all of the RDG strategic activity. So this is an example from the Smarter Information, Smarter Journeys program. You can't see the detail. That's not deliberate, I promise. But what we're doing is we're really understanding what the priorities are within Wavelength for customers. What are those most important touch points? How are we performing against them? Where are the pain points? What should we be doing in programs such as this to make a difference? And this was an example of a really good approach to embedding that insight within those strategic conversations that have actually resulted in some sort of tangible, both short, medium and long-term initiatives that are now going to be taken forward. This is the second page of that. 2 more things to talk about, I think, before I just pause. One around COVID itself. Within the Wavelength survey, we ask, what emotions people are experiencing when they're travelling by rail through COVID. Actually, the majority of people travelling respond in a positive way. Safe, relaxed, calm. Getting up to sort of a fifth or a quarter of responses. And actually, it's sort of low single figures in terms of the people that say they're angry, scared, or frustrated. But clearly, they're people that we still need to work on and make a difference for. This actually doesn't come from Wavelength, but comes from Transport Focus, and you may well have seen this. This is sort of getting for 6 months old now. But actually, what we what they spotted in their research was actually some of the really important touch points are performing better, but the overall satisfaction levels are still quite slow. So take a couple here. How staff helped you feel during the journey, sort of mid-range in terms of its importance through COVID, but actually the overall satisfaction score was very low at 55%. So again, this just demonstrates we have done a good job through COVID, but there's more that we need to do, especially in terms of safety and security with regards to COVID. Which links up this slide actually, where we measure this at a high level through wavelength, and we can see that it has picked up in recent periods, probably as the vaccination program has been rolled out more extensively, and people seem more comfortable with where we are as a country and traveling around. But again, it's sort of 7.6, 7.7. There's still more we can do. We really want everyone to feel safe traveling by train. I know that's probably unrealistic at the moment, but it's something we need to strive for. We also, actually, this relates to some work over a year old now. This is when COVID first hit, but DFT, using the wavelength touch points, wavelength journey phases, did some research looking at the importance of some of these touch points. And probably, as you'd expect, the importance associated with some of these touch points changed quite significantly as COVID hit. So status of the train, safety, compensation, they were all really important when COVID first hit, and we hadn't actually seen them being that important previously. Well, they're clearly important, but they hadn't come through as the highest drivers of with the greatest expectation previously. I'll just finish by saying, got a couple of slides here. Some of you may have seen this before. I presented a few of these at a conference a couple of weeks ago, but it's not all doom and gloom. Actually, it's a great opportunity to attract more people back to rail, and more people to try rail by, as a new thing or for the first time. And here I've just got a few ideas that we jotted down based on the insight we've seen both through wavelength and through other sources. I think we're probably familiar with this slide actually, that rail demand has been slower to rebound than other modes. If you look at the road traffic there, it picked back up to 100% quite quickly after the first lockdown, whereas rail didn't get above 40%. These are a bit out of date now. Clearly, we're more up to 40 or 50% now in terms of national rail. But rail didn't rebound as quickly. People have generally travelled shorter distances since COVID hit, and as a result, rail maybe not be the mode of choice or appropriate for some of those journeys. But clearly we wanted to rebound more quickly, and there are initiatives underway around, for example, a national marketing campaign that should seek to achieve that. We also know that customers are going to travel differently. Actually, we produce a tracker every couple of months with an RDG. It shows that 12% of rail users will increase their travel versus pre-COVID, but 45% will reduce it. That doesn't mean we'll have a third less people traveling. Depends on the mix of people, commuters, leisure, and so on. Actually, leisure is one that's looking like it's not going to be too badly affected if you look at the insight that we see, and so that should probably be a focus for us as an industry to make sure we're getting those people to travel by rail. Very wordy slide, won't go through all the detail, but the crux of this really is the peak off-peak thing is likely to be quite different in future. We might find days become peak time rather than hours. Weekends become suddenly more of a peak issue than the weekday mornings, for example, because more people want to travel for leisure purposes at the weekend. But it's a really good opportunity to reassess the offer. It ties into things like fares reform I mentioned previously, and here I'm just emphasising that leisure isn't just one one unified market. There are lots of different reasons to travel by rail for leisure purposes. You could be going to the seaside, you could be going to do some shopping, you could be visiting friends or family, loads of different options. And I think we've been guilty in the past of just considering certainly RDG actually as leisure as one sort of group of people, and actually the granularity is really important there, because each different type of leisure travel might merit a different focus. I think this is probably my last slide. Clearly there are opportunities to be seized. I mentioned the peak versus off-peak thing just now. What are the new peak times and how do we address them, especially if we want to be really careful that we're not overfilling our trains at the moment, but enabling people that do want to travel. We need to make sure that ticketing is appropriate. You hopefully have seen that flexi seasons were launched earlier this week. That's a good example of a change that clearly was needed, but actually as an industry we worked very quickly together to get that out in the open and enable people to travel in a different way. We need to make sure that we retain and develop loyalty from regular customers. That's obvious, clearly, and we need to make sure that rail is seen as a safe mode of transport, and in addition to all the other really core drivers of satisfaction that I mentioned previously. Just a quick word about freight. Freight has performed particularly well, actually, in terms of demand, in terms of performance, through this COVID period. Not least because the space freed up by fewer customer trains. What do you call the passenger trains here? But fewer trains running on the network has enabled freight to operate in a different way. And clearly there are decarbonisation benefits, both for more goods travelling by freight train, but also for more people travelling by rail, just generally. And my final point here is really there are threats, because it's likely we're going to see fewer people travelling by rail than we did pre-COVID, but there are a lot of opportunities, and I think really putting the customer at the heart of our work and understanding the experience through things like the wavelength data, but obviously individual operators and transport organisations have their own insights as well, but it's really important to sort of focus on the customer, what they need, and make sure we're delivering that to ensure we get as many people back to rail as possible. That's it. I'll stop there. Hopefully that made sense.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Bree. Thanks so much indeed. I think it's for me, it's particularly interesting to see that presentation, to just appreciate not just the frequency, but also the breadth and the depth of data that's being collected there. It's actually a massive undertaking, isn't it? And I think it's interesting for those of us that work in the rail industry as well to have some kind of overall view and overall perspective of what the ultimate passengers and customers of our service think of what we're doing. And I think that wavelength data is really powerful in providing that for me in particular, I think. So again, thanks very much. I said we'd open up the floor to any questions. I see there's a few in the chat box already, but if anybody else wants to add any questions in, please feel free to do so, and I'll attempt to do a bit of moderation and get some of those answered. But I wonder if I could be greedy and start with one of my own. I was particularly fascinated. I think you mentioned something about trying to engage with people that don't currently use the railway, and I was interested to understand, first of all, how you do that, and secondly, are there any overall themes that people who don't use the railway have communicated through wavelength?
Yeah, so before COVID hit, 10% of our wavelength survey base was reserved. They had a 10% quota for non-users of the service, and yeah, you're right. We there were some themes that come out of that. Actually, for a number of those people, just rail wasn't an appropriate mode for the journey they wanted to take. But there was a lot of confusion around fares and ticketing in particular, and I guess that's self-evident and not that surprising. But actually, we did see that actually by getting things like fares correct, hopefully over time, that we could be attracting more people to rail that just haven't considered it previously. And obviously we know the overall modal share for rail is really low. It's single figure percentages in terms of overall trips made. So there's a really, there is clearly an untapped market there that we need to try and infiltrate.
Interesting. Okay, picking up some of the other questions that have been submitted. I see we've got Julia on from RSSB, and go back to my point about using wavelength as almost a barometer for staff. I think Julia's making the point about sharing this data as well. And I think you mentioned earlier, Billy, that the TOCs and Network Rail see this data, but Julia's raising a point there about how shareable this data is to other parties.
Yeah, so we want it to be, so we're working closely with DFT on the program and developing the data. We want it to be sort of open source data. We see massive benefit in making this granularity of data, frequency of data available to all. In the same way as things like Darwin, train running information data was made available to all, and actually can generate a lot of innovation and improve sort of customer facing initiatives, and actually we see a lot of benefit in doing the same with wavelength data. I sort of alluded to it a bit earlier in that we're not there yet in terms of the robustness of the data. We want to make sure that what we do share is truly robust, and the operators that use it at the moment recognise where the pitfalls are. So that's what we are working on for the second half of this year, to create a new sort of measurement approach, using the existing fundamentals, but just making sure the data is truly robust, and therefore we can share it, and it's been fully quality assured, and it's driving the right outcomes. That's the journey we're on, but absolutely agree with the principle of sharing it widely.
You mentioned briefly open data there. Do you think the type of data that's within Wavelength is, I'm not sure quite what the exact term is, but would it be too commercially sensitive to share, or do you think there is stuff that we can do with this that can be accessible to a wider party without damaging commercial interests?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, clearly there are sensitivities, at top level, but we do need to make sure that it is being used by as wide an audience as possible. So yeah, no, I do think it's appropriate for that use, but we need to just work that out, and obviously so that our members are supportive of that as well. Yeah,
great stuff. So Stella's making the point about accessibility, which is a really important theme for the railway as a whole, and I think she's asking a specific question around do we collect any data, particularly around the experience of passengers with accessibility needs at all?
Yeah, we do. So there are two elements to that within Wavelength. I guess it's similar probably to National Passenger Survey. We ask specific, there are specific touch points in there around satisfaction with assistance, whether it's pre-booked or not. But then we also can cut the data to understand if the customer has accessibility needs as well. And I should probably just obviously say, if anyone wants cuts of the data, we'd have to establish exactly what can be provided, but information such as accessibility data, absolutely really important to ensure we understand how those services are being received and where we need to improve them. So the data is in there, and we'd love it to be used.
Okay, that's great. Julia's also asking about, she's saying there's obviously a powerful link between performance and data, and this is maybe something that's valuable and can be explored further within RSSB's Perform programme. That's not something I'm personally aware of, but I don't know if that's something you're aware of there, Billy.
I'm not aware of it. Happy to hear more about it, but yeah, I think the principle of having really regular customer experience data. So industry wide, we've had things like NRPS twice a year, but now if we're collecting data on a weekly basis, and something like performance data is quite useful, it's very possible to create that at a weekly level and understanding those linkages. So I don't know about the Perform programme, but I definitely feel that's something that we need to achieve through Wavelength, and actually that can, as I said, result in more informed decisions around scheduling and how you deal with disruption if you actually know empirically what kind of impact that's going to have on customers. Yeah,
good stuff. Okay, there's also a question from Priya. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. But talking there about iterations of the programme and how frequently the programme is reviewed or revised. I'm wondering, maybe that's in terms of the data that's collected or the programme as a whole. Do you have any kind of response to that, Billy, at all, about how things are changed and iterated?
Yeah, no, firstly, hello Priya, hope you're well. Yes, we have a sort of Wavelength strategy group, we call it, which are sort of senior colleagues across our membership, so owning groups and Network Rail, and that group really establishes the vision and the ambition for Wavelength, both in terms of the data, but also how it's positioned within the industry, how it feeds into those other strategic activities. And then, as a result of that, that strategic group agreeing the strategy and vision for Wavelength, then we have a program team, which is RDG and DFT, that deliver against that strategy on a sort of week-by-week basis. So essentially, that strategy group meets every quarter, and that's really the time we reassess whether Wavelength is on the right path, whether it does need to change tack at all, especially with all the reform type activity. We need to make sure that it's supporting that that work as well, and feeding into the future. So yeah, there are I'd say probably 4 times a year through that strategy group is the best time. If any sort of operators or network rail want to know who their reps are on that group, then reach out to me and I can let you know.
Of course, I guess the most recent example of that, I guess the whole COVID pandemic had a massive change on the way the whole program was operating, and probably quite, well, obviously completely unanticipated.
It did, yeah. So we paused the survey for 3 months or so. So we had collected, I probably didn't mention this earlier, but prior to COVID, we had about 70,000 completed surveys, really, really good source of data. But actually when COVID hit and obviously we went down to 5% demand almost overnight, we were unable to serve the survey in the same way. So we paused it for 3 months or so, and then we started up again with the support of members on a more limited basis. So the interim survey, as we call it, which, as I said, looks at 94 touch points rather than 106, doesn't get all that importance information that we used to get. But we want to get back to that old way of working. Now demand's high enough to get robust sample sizes. We need to return to that sort of forcing or dancing approach, I think.
Right, we can always rely on Nathaniel for a tough question. So here we go. With the with the recent announcement of the enabling framework agreement for TOCs in England, will the wavelength data will be used to help shape what TOCs look like in the future, so we can deliver on the points in most demand from the customer? Now I can't see Billy anymore, so I wonder if he's. Oh, that's.
I'm still there. Can you just repeat that? I had an interloper for about 2 seconds.
Yeah, no problem. Going for one of those TV moments where the
I'm sure I got rid of the video in time.
Yeah, you missed the toughest question of the evening.
That wasn't deliberate.
So this is from Nathaniel. He's saying about enabling framework agreements for TOCs in England. Do we think that wavelength data can be used to help shape what TOCs will look like in the future post the restructure? I'm not sure if that's referring to enabling agreement or whether it's something connected with the Williams Schaap review. But short question is, can the wavelength data be used to help look at what the structured TOCs will look like in the future?
Yeah, I think it needs to. It probably needs to be more robust than it currently is, in all honesty. But the structure of the data is certainly there. And that's really why we're, as RDG, we are plugged into all these reform initiatives, as I said, but we're really trying to champion the insight we've got through Wavelength to make sure that the right decisions are made in terms of the future structure. So we know that there is a focus on the customer through the white paper. We know that those initiatives are going to clearly need to use customer experience data, of which Wavelength is a really valuable source in our opinion, and therefore we will be feeding that in. But it's probably too early to say exactly what those operations would look like in future. But as I'd say that we will be ensuring Wavelength is considered in their design, not that we would do the design itself.
I mean, it's such a good source of data and views. It would obviously be a great shame, a great waste if it wasn't considered in things like that, really, wouldn't it? So it seems to have a great fit for those kind of scenarios.
Yeah.
Okay. Any last call for questions? We're coming up to a couple of minutes before the hour. So if you get any last questions, do drop them in the chat. Julia's just making a point in the chat there about accessibility, pointing towards passenger assistant and trans report work that's being done within RDG. So that's, as she says, probably a really good source to have a look at in terms of accessibility stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Actually, the wavelength survey I've talked about just now isn't going to answer every question. It gives a good overview, and you can drill in because of the granularity and frequency of the data. You can drill into the results in a way we haven't been able to before, but it's not going to answer all the detailed questions we might have around specific elements of the journey. So individual, deep dives, separate pieces of insight and research will absolutely still be required. For example, the trans report, passenger assist stuff is really important to understand how that service is being received. And actually, Wavelength, can support some of that activity, but there is clearly a need for ongoing research into specific elements of the journey to understand how they're being delivered.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Well, on that note, I just think we'd all like to say a really big thank you to Billy for that. I think we've really got our money's worth tonight. We had a great presentation and also gave him a really good grilling with questions towards the end there, which were brilliantly answered. So thank you very much indeed, Billy, for joining us for that. That was really great. And I think you mentioned during the presentation it might be possible to get a hold of the slides as well if people want to dig into some more of the detail of wavelength.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'll get them with you so you can forward them around.
Super, we can get them distributed. So again, thank you very much. Thank you so much for speaking this evening. Like I say, it was really interesting to appreciate everything that goes into wavelength and how it can be used in the future. I don't know if Nathaniel, you want to say anything else before I kind of wrap things up? I'll put him on the spot there. No, if are you on mute?
It's all right. My computer momentarily froze at the perfect moment. No, I'd really just like to thank everyone for coming. And once again, thanks to our sponsors who make things like this possible. And thank you to Billy and also yourself, Stephen, for both giving up your time to host this one tonight. As Stephen's already mentioned, this will be available to review on the website. And obviously, Billy has kindly agreed to share the slides and obviously take up any sort of dialogue afterwards that has come from the matter. So yeah, with that, thank you very much. Keep your eyes out for more interesting stuff like this on the agenda soon, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much, all.
Brilliant. Thanks everyone for coming.
Great.
Cheers.